Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our UXPA webinar about accessibility. We're going to be starting in just 1 minute. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you again, everybody, for joining. This is Jen Romano-Bergstrom, the president of UXPA International, and I'm really excited to be here with you today here for this accessibility webinar. Accessibility is something that's really important to me, and I'm so happy to see that it's important to so many of you who have joined us here today. Before I turn it over to our excellent speakers, I just wanted to quickly say a couple things about UXPA. For those of you who are not already on our mailing list, you will be now because you're attending this webinar. So stay tuned for upcoming information about various activities that we have going on. We're currently planning for our annual conference, which is taking place in June in Scottsdale, Arizona. All submissions are currently under review, so soon we'll be announcing the acceptances and posting the program online. So stay tuned for that. I hope to see you out in Arizona in June. And then, of course, we have monthly webinars. Please check out our website for other upcoming webinars, as well as short courses. We'd love to see you attend additional events that we have going on. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to the speakers today who will be talking about WCAG 2.1, what you need to know about the most recent accessibility standards. We have with us today Eduardo Meza Etienne. He's the Director of Compliance at Essential Accessibility. And Eduardo is a brain injury survivor. He's been involved in the accessibility and disabilities field for 20 years, working for numerous government agencies and small contractors in the Washington, D.C. area. He's a certified professional in accessibility core competencies by the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, and he holds a Bachelor of Science in Economics, a Master of Science in Accounting and Finance from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a master's degree in international management from the Thunderbird School of Global Management in Glendale, Arizona. And joining Eduardo is Kara Zirkel. Kara is the manager of compliance and training at Essential Accessibility. She has over 18 years of experience working with individuals with disabilities in education and outreach. She's an advocate and educator with regard to providing technical support, awareness, and guidance on assistive technologies, as well as the laws around overall accessibility in those that protect individuals with disabilities. Both Eduardo and Kara have extensive experience with accessibility. They're both true subject matter experts, and I'm really excited to have you both here with me today. Welcome.
All right, thank you. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So looking at WCAG 2.0 and talking about what it is that we need to look at in regard to the most recent accessibility standards. So we like to start out a little bit by just talking about the disability market, and really, because one of the questions we often get is just how many people are there with disabilities, or how much is this really going to affect my role or responsibility? And really, when we're looking at that, it's 1.3 billion people with a disability globally. And when we're looking at that, it's also one of those of the friends and families of those individuals with disabilities have a very close connection. So when we look at that, we actually really try to include those groups as well, because if someone doesn't have the ability to access information, it's very common that those friends and family will also then not work with or access that same website, because as a support mechanism, they want to support their friends or their families with disabilities. So that actually includes another 2.4 billion consumers that have some kind of emotional connection to that disability. So when we're talking about that in income, or even that of the clients, the customers, and money, revenue, people with disabilities control about $2 trillion in income, and the friends and family add an additional $8+ trillion in that disposable income. So you can really see the ability of where that could really have an effect on your platforms that you're working with. When we're talking about disabilities, you often hear a lot of web accessibility, and you think a lot of vision. So anything that's going to be blind, low vision, things like that, because many of the times that we're talking about including accessibility, we're having to include areas of alt text for images, missing descriptions and things like that in order to allow individuals with that blind or low vision to be able to have that access. But in reality, the level of accessibility that we have to include for that group actually trickles down to mobility, speech, cognitive, a lot of other areas, because cognitive disabilities is actually one of the largest groups of individuals with disabilities. And the other thing to keep in mind is all of these disabilities can be anything from a permanent to a situational or even a temporary, whether it's going to be a car accident, whether it's an illness, maybe a reaction to a drug medication, or even then that permanent disability focus. So these are things to think about of how many customers you might actually have with disabilities. When we're looking at that, about 71% of those customers will leave a website if it's difficult to use or not accessible. And if you look at that, really those customers represent about 10% of the online spending. So if you're doing some e-commerce or something like that, consider that as part of the groups that you might be working with. So when we look at trying to really dive deeper and understand the WCAG standards, it's important to actually look at the background of web content accessibility guidelines. So W3C originally published these web content accessibility guidelines, WCAG, in 1999 as WCAG 1.0. In 2008, they updated it as WCAG 2.0, and then the most recent was actually published on June 5th for the WCAG 2.1, which is what we'll be talking about today. Just know that everything is backwards compatible from 2.1 to 2.2 or 2.0, so that way there's nothing that you won't be able to achieve if you're looking at 2.0 and then moving over to 2.1. But it's also very important to realize that WCAG is really that international standard. So regardless of where you're located or where your customers are located, if you're really looking at that WCAG compliance, then that's going to be an inclusive environment that you can talk to, whether it's US, Canada, Europe, Brazil, anything along those lines, because the standard is usually WCAG level AA. So from here, I'll go ahead and hand it off to Eduardo to really kind of dive a little deeper into WCAG 2.1.
Excellent. Thank you, Kara. All right, so let's talk a little bit more details about WCAG 2.0, which is the basis of WCAG 2.1. And as Kara mentioned, it is backward compatible. Know that both 2.0 and 2.1 are stable and referenceable technical standards. We're looking at 12 guidelines on WCAG 2.0, and they've added a 13th guideline on 2.1. And they're all organized under 4 principles. We'll talk about this later in the presentation. Also known as the PUR principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And each guideline has a testable success criteria. Okay, and we'll again go into more detail later in the presentation as to how many there are for each one of the conformance levels and so on and so forth. So the next slide actually shows the 13th guideline that has been added to WCAG 2.1. And here you can actually see they're actually focusing their attention on the input modalities: pointer gestures, pointer cancellation, labeling, name, motion, actuation. We'll give some examples around that, but just to give you some perspective, a good example of this new guideline would probably include somebody with a cerebral palsy, right, that may not control their movement, trying to pinch the tablet, for instance, to zoom in. So in order to address that, what the World Wide Web Consortium has done is, okay, you need to keep those people into consideration. So a good way of addressing that from an accessibility perspective would be to actually add zoom in and zoom out buttons to the application. So instead of having to pinch, then they can just tap on those buttons. Another good example of this guideline would be, imagine somebody with low vision, for instance, using a web conferencing application on their device and trying to hit the mute button, but accidentally touching the end call button, right? So what would happen there? It would end the call. So what the guideline would call for is that by tapping the wrong button, and if you slide your finger, it will actually take you off the end call button, and it will prevent you from actually ending the call. So those little details that may not cross our minds are actually being addressed by this new guideline. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Excellent. So what is being taken into consideration under WCAG 2.1? Obviously, a lot of time went by from WCAG 2.0, which was released in 2008. Almost 10 years went by. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to compensate some of the gaps that they left out in 2.0. So one of them is address the increased usage of mobile devices. So basically, it's about mobile accessibility. It's making sure that any phones or tablet applications are accessible. Any digital TVs are also incorporating accessibility within that scope. Wearables, any Internet of Things, things of that nature. In addition to that, they've actually addressed the population with low vision. Right, that was not included in 2.0, so they've actually enhanced those requirements. And lastly, the third component that they've really added a lot of emphasis is the cognitive and learning disabilities. So those are the three main areas where the WCAG 2.1 technical requirements have put most of their focus. And it is important to note, and to Kara's point, this new requirement is really, you can expect this to be implemented or added into legislation, hopefully very, very soon. But we know that the European Union has already committed to incorporate that starting in 2019. So that is important to note. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so let's delve now into the nitty-gritty, if you will. How does it look, WCAG 2.0 vis-a-vis WCAG 2.1? So as you can see, each one of the technical requirements is broken down by conformance level. So we have level A, which is the very basic level of accessibility. And there on 2.0, we had 25 technical requirements. 2.1 has added 5. So in total, we have 30 at level A. Level AA is the intermediate level of accessibility. It really includes the biggest and most common barriers to people with disabilities. And that's what you typically see thriving for most of the organizations out there. And then on 2.0, we had 13 technical requirements. WCAG 2.1 has added 7. So in total, between level A and AA, we're looking at 50 success criteria on WCAG 2.1. Level AAA is what I like to call the holy grail of accessibility, is the highest level of accessibility. And even the W3C states that it's really hard to accomplish, but if your organization is willing to thrive for that level, the better you'll be, when it comes to your accessibility standing. So let's move on to the next one, please. Wonderful. So we mentioned earlier, how the WCAG is based on guidelines, and they are all based on the 4 principles, perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So what are those in particular? So the website, in order for a website to be perceivable, a website can be visited by people with very different types of perceptive preferences and needs, but also by robots such as search engines and translators. So the information and user interface components must address this specific handicap. In other words, what this principle is calling for is that the information that you're trying to relay on your site must be perceivable by at least one of the senses, whether it's vision, hearing, and so on. So the second principle would be operable. And what that means is that web designers must be aware of the different devices the users can manage to use the website. So they must take the user interface components and navigation elements in a way that everyone can operate with it. For example, don't limit user input to only mouse or pointers. Okay, so make it available to as many devices as possible. The third principle, next slide, please, would be understandable. And this actually addresses many disabilities. But basically, what you want to try to accomplish here is if a user doesn't understand what you're trying to talk about, or we make him or her feel lost within your site, then there's a problem, obviously. So you need to design the website in such a way that it has a consistent look and feel, and you can let the user know that they can find things easily. Not only that, the language that is being used to relay the information is as understandable and easy to comprehend as possible. And the last principle would be robust. So here you want to make sure that the content is robust enough that it can be interpreted in a reliable manner by a wide variety of user agents, including assistive technologies. So this means that users must be able to access the content as technologies evolve or advance. Okay, so any advancements in technology, you want to make sure that the web application or website will actually be able to support and be as robust as possible and be able to interact with that new technology. So at this point, I would like to pass the presentation back to Kara. Kara?
All right, thank you. So going through a little bit of this, what we like to do is we like to do a WCAG breakdown. And before we actually break the standards down, we actually like to look at it per your role, because really the life cycle process of everyone plays a part, and depending upon where accessibility applies in that role is going to be dependent upon how difficult it might be for the next role as things kind of move through that process. So when we're looking at this, we're trying to look at it specifically as designers, content authors, developers, and then quality assurance, which has really become your new testers, your accessibility testers. And so what we'll do is we'll break this down a little bit more per role. But what we like to do is, in this instance, you'll see on this very bottom, there's a WCAG quick reference guide. And I'm going to bring that up very quickly, because what it does is it takes you to this page. And this page will give you all the content of the various WCAG standards, but we really want to focus on the filter side. And when we're looking at this as a filter, you can actually do a drop down to say, I want to look at everything, WCAG 2.0 and 2.1, and that's when you'd select your 2.1. Or you can say, you know what, I understand 2.0, I only want to look at 2.1. Then you can look at only 2.1 from there. As you make these changes, it's going to make your changes over here on the right. So we'll look at 2.1 right now, but then you can actually look at it based upon your role. So say for this instance, we'll look at the design, both interactive as well as visual. And if you want to look at something to say, you know what, I always have a problem remembering what I'm supposed to do with CAPTCHA. How can I do look at CAPTCHA? You can always add your tags as well, and your tags will also include only CAPTCHA if you're really looking at that. So it kind of allows for an additional feature that you can use to kind of help learn something that is more of your problematic area. In this instance, we won't use any tags, but you can also look at your levels, level A, AA, and AAA. And as Eduardo had mentioned, the standard usually is WCAG level AA. So we'll uncheck AAA right now. Then we have your techniques. Your sufficient techniques is really giving you your detailed information. It'll give you some examples on how to use things, whereas your advisory techniques are a little bit more of your summary level. And then your failures. And your failures is really learning what not to do. It's always going to fail. So when you're first starting out and learning how to use this, I always say keep all three of these checked, so that way, based upon your learning style, you'll get something that you need to really learn and understand these pieces. But then the last part is your technologies. And that way, as a designer, you might not necessarily do a lot of HTML or ARIA coding, or you might not do any scripting on the client or server side. So you can pick and choose based upon what applies to you, whereas a developer might only be looking at the heavy code side. So you can go through and uncheck anything that might not apply. So we can uncheck some client and server-side scripting. If you don't know what something stands for, you can highlight over it, and it'll tell you it's the Synchronized Multimedia Integration Language, SMIL. So we'll uncheck that, and we'll uncheck PDF, Flash, and Silverlight for right now. So we'll only look at HTML, CSS, and ARIA in this instance. So what I've done is I now look over here to say, okay, anything that applies to a designer in some aspect, only from a level A and AA for WCAG 2.1. Then we look over here to these areas. And what happens is you can look at what it is. If you want some information of what 1.1 means, you can see what that really kind of stands for. If you understand what that is and just want to look directly at the success criteria, which is your 1.1.1, which is your always triple numbers, you can look at your show description, and that's going to actually tell you all the things that apply to it. So it's not just images, it's also CAPTCHA, your time-based media, things like that. But then really the meat of it is tell me what to do, tell me how to fix it. And that's really showing your techniques and failures. So if we look at this, and I'm going to uncheck both of these right now. So then I'm going to look at just my failures, and it's actually going to tell you what's specifically going to cause the success criteria to fail. And this is going to be a good learning aspect for you to see what not to do. But then you can say, you know what, okay, now I know what's not going to work. I want to understand it from a high level. Then here's your advisory, and it kind of gives you a very summarized version of what to look for or do to keep that accessibility standard. But then you can say, you know what, I understand these things, I just need to know how to fix it. So this is your sufficient techniques. And what it does is it gives you situations so you can see which of these situations are going to apply most to your scenario. And in this instance, we'll say situation A, if a short description can serve the same purpose as a present, the same information as a non-text, it's essentially meaning, you know, adding that alt text label to that image to serve that same purpose. Then we can say, okay, that's going to apply most to me, and I want to do it for, say, HTML. So then I can say, based upon all of this, HTML, or maybe using ARIA, I do suggest when you're using this, always right-click and open it into a new tab, because what happens is it may cause too much of a rabbit hole and you're always having to go back to this page. So when you right-click and open it into a new tab, it's going to take you directly to the W3C page. And this is where you can actually go through and get your examples, and it dives directly into those examples from there. Not everything is code-based. Just keep that in mind. But you know, this is going to be a great way to be able to use a lot of these features or this tool to be able to see what your role and responsibility specifically might be. So when we're looking at this, we realize that, you know, sometimes you just want a cheat sheet as well. And that's one of the things that we've also tried to provide. So in this instance, looking at designers, level A, AA, and AAA, this is anything of WCAG 2.0 as well as 2.1. So anyone designing anything that has a look and feel to it, that has some kind of looking for the website functionality, things like that, something to be appealing, you know, aesthetically, this is going to be applied to you as a designer. Then we do the same thing as your content author, so anyone writing content. But then let's keep in mind, it's not just for your websites and your applications. Content authors could also apply to your documents if it's going to be posted to the web. So then we also look at the same for your developers. And your developers are really anyone that's using any code type language to develop, create these websites, applications, mobile apps, and things like that. But then when we look at it from a quality assurance perspective, remember, this is becoming your new tester. So then that's where all standards apply, because they're having to check to see that anything that applied to the previous roles that we just showed were checked off and accessibility was incorporated. So they're just some quick and easy ways to kind of show and see what might apply to you based upon your role, but also how it applies from a larger life cycle perspective. So Eduardo, I'll hand it back over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Kara. Excellent information. All right, so now let's get into the details of each one of the 12 additional success criteria at level A and AA within 2.1. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but as we go through the slides, I'll pick probably one or two examples. of each one of them. So the way the slide is structured, we on the first column, we give you the actual success criterion for 2.1. The next column is the conformance level, A or AA. And then the third column will summarize a little bit the requirement using just plain language. And then the last column, who does it help and how? It defines maybe the type of disability that is being addressed. But most importantly, I'd like to just give you some real life examples of each one of this, or a few of this. So let's pick the first one, 1.3.4 orientation. So basically what that one requires you to do is that it doesn't matter how you're holding your mobile device. You want to make sure that, or ensure that, the content can be displayed in the preferred orientation, whether it's portrait or landscape. So unless the presentation is essential, obviously there's exceptions to the rule, to the functionality. This is very important for users who actually mount their mobile devices to a fixed orientation. Just, one of the examples would be somebody using a wheelchair and just mounting the mobile device on the arm. So that would be one example. Another one would be to have trouble rotating the device due to limited motor skills or mobility. So again, most of the devices have the ability to adjust the display orientation based on sensory information. So again, this is a new requirement, pretty basic, and I think must be taken into consideration. So let's move on to the next slide, please, Kara. Thank you so much. So here we have the next 4 success criteria, and I would like to talk about the first one on this slide, which is reflow. So the goal of the reflow is to support low vision users by enabling easier readability and tracking through responsive design. So basically, when your site is at 400 zoom, the content should automatically present itself in actually one column. So scrolling in more than one direction is unnecessary. So basically, no scrolling either way. And just want to make sure that you actually are able to test on screens as small as 320 pixels wide for a common mobile device screen size. So again, the requirements are very specific, but again, you want to ensure that the content reflows, it doesn't truncate any of the content, there's no overlap, or there's no need for specific scrolling either way, vertically or horizontally. Another requirement here is the text spacing. And again, the intent is to ensure that low vision individuals or dyslexic users can actually overwrite the set text spacing to enable easier readability for increased individual reading speed. So it's again very specific, but the way to configure this is you want to ensure that you actually use EM percentages when you're dealing with the font size, and you want to specify the letter spacing and the line spacing in a way that it fits within the size of the text containers. So again, very specific, but again, as you can see, it points to those specific disabilities that they're trying to fill the gap with, which is individuals with low vision. And Kara, I remember that we in our dry run, yes, thank you very much. We had talked about walking the audience as to how to go about. That slide actually has a link to what Kara is showing you on the screen. So that is one of the requirements, and you can see the different items that need to be taken into consideration, and then you can click on understanding the actual criteria. Not only that, but you can also click on an example. So in some instances, you have a graphic example on how to address the issue, and in some instances, you may actually have code level examples, but this one actually, addresses the requirement of the content on hover or focus must be accessible or visible, and it also tackles the low vision individuals. Thank you, Kara. And lastly, we have the last set of success criteria here on this slide, and I'd like to talk about the one in the middle, the pointer gestures, and the intent of this particular success criterion is to support users with limited mobility who are unable to perform any complex gestures in an accurate manner. So what that allows them to do is, when taking care of this particular requirement, is, going back to the earlier example where you're trying to pinch to zoom in and swipe, you must be able to override that requirement by allowing them to instead be able to tap or double tap, or maybe have a long press to access the same information. Okay, so let's move on to our next slide, please. Actually, I thought that was the last one set of requirements. This is the last one with the last three success criteria on WCAG 2.1. And I like to give you an example of the intent of label in name. So basically, this is pretty straightforward. What this one requires is that whatever you see on that label should also be on the back end of at the code level. So whatever is being represented should also be addressed at the code level. And an easy way of addressing that is by implementing an ARIA label, so screen readers can actually register and read back correctly the name of that specific element that is using the label. Again, pretty straightforward requirement. Okay, so let's talk about some practicality. What are the most common challenges from an accessibility perspective? So I'm pretty sure some of you may have hit some of this in the past, but basically the first one is navigation. Navigation is, you want to ensure that there is a consistent way of finding things across your site, and that every element can be actionable via the mouse, and also has keyboard support. When we talk about keyboard support, any actionable element on your site or application must be actionable via the keyboard by hitting the enter key or your space bar. Okay, so the second one is site structure. Site structure. You want to make sure that your website has the proper structure, meaning it has the proper heading levels, the proper semantics that allows you to navigate through the different regions: header, footer, main content, sidebars, and so on and so forth. The third one is actually text, and it actually has to do with design. When you think about text, you need to think about typography. You need to pick the right font choice, and make sure that it's sans serif, ideally. It's easier to read, and you again want to make sure that you implement that via your CSS, obviously. The next item here on the most common list of accessibility issues is images. Obviously, any image that you have on your site must have an alternative text, and it will depend on the context where that image is located on your site. Images can be informative. Images can be decorative. If it's decorative, you have an alternative text, but it's blank. There's nothing in it. So that way, if there's a screen reader that hits that image with a blank alternative text, it just skips it and knows that it's just decorative in nature. The next item is hyperlinks. This is a very common issue that we come across, especially with e-commerce sites. You need to be descriptive on your links. You cannot use learn more or click here. And if you're going to do that, you want to make sure that you add the proper label on the back end via an ARIA label, ARIA described by. So again, there's different techniques to prevent that from happening. But again, if you can avoid the use of non-descriptive links, please do so, because it does have a huge impact. As you know, screen readers have the ability to pull the links within a web page. So imagine just having 10, 15 learn mores or click here's. That could be very confusing. Forms, when we're dealing with forms, make sure that they're properly labeled. Not only that, but also that they're organized in such a manner that they're associated with the proper ID, label ID, And also the tab order within the form, you want to make sure that it's logical. You don't jump from first name to date of birth and then back to last name. And lastly, multimedia and documents. If you have video content on your site, please ensure that they do have captions. If they need audio description, they have the description, and also the proper transcript that goes with that video content. And if you have any kind of documents, whether that's PDFs or any Microsoft Office documents, please make sure that they are also accessible and properly tagged. Okay, so the next section of the presentation is getting to the fun part here and talk a little bit about some of the testing methodologies out there and how at Essential Accessibility we go beyond the best practices. So let's talk about how you would check a current application or web application for accessibility. You see the four main components there. Obviously, you want to make sure that accessibility is brought in since the very beginning of the development life cycle. So that's at the wireframe mock-up stage. That's when you want to bring accessibility to the forefront. Color contrast, ensuring that the structure is there. And the next step there would be to, okay, so am I going to be striving for WCAG 2.1? Is it going to be WCAG 2.0? What conformance level is it going to be? The next step in the process would be to make sure that you have the proper accessibility checklist. And I think that that resource that Kara was showcasing by role, it's a wonderful quick reference from the W3C website where you can actually pull some of the requirements and understanding what the actual technical requirements are for each one of the success criteria. And then you want to make sure that you follow that methodology to implement those specific guidelines and success criteria. And the last piece when you're testing, please, you must test, unfortunately, and we'll talk about automated testing tools further down the presentation, but you must use real users when you're testing for accessibility compliance. Otherwise, you're leaving a very important component of accessibility testing here. And the other piece is just make sure that you're also adding different environments, because individuals with disabilities have a very unique way of interacting with the web. And again, that needs to be taken into consideration. Next slide, please. Thank you, Kara. Okay, so just from an overall perspective, we use a three-pronged approach here at Essential Accessibility when testing for accessibility compliance. We use a combination of automated testing tools, which on average capture about 25 to 30% of the accessibility issues, code level review at the HTML level, and then the third component, which is key here, is ensuring that you incorporate functional testing by having them complete specific tasks, any core tasks or flows within your application or website, that there are no major roadblocks when they interact with different assistive technologies using different environments, combination of assistive technology and browsers. So I think I give this presentation back to you, Kara.
All right, thank you. So when we're looking at this, one of the questions we get with working with clients is, what's a test scope look like, and how do you come up with that sample? So if you're trying to do something like that internally, then one of the things that we look at is we really determine your customer workflow. So whether you are an e-commerce and it's going to be from the point of a customer searching your website all the way out to checkout, purchasing an item, or if it's going to be higher education and it's going to be a prospective student wanting to look at a school, applying all the way through graduating, anything else in between. Or maybe it's going to be an internal employee workflow. So maybe the application to a job, maybe the insurance documents, the onboarding and things like that from start to finish. What do these workflows look like? We also look at it from the highest used site. So we look at Google Analytics. because that's really going to provide that information. And then we also want to make sure, as part of that Google Analytics, to find those highest number of pages, we also include any pages that have any accessibility specific information. So if you have a accessibility statement or something along those lines, one of the services we provide is an accessibility channel, to where we build that out, that has an accessibility statement that provides sometimes a roadmap that pulls in all of the inclusion, diversity around whether it's employees from an internal perspective or customers on an external perspective, using the assistive technology and things like that. So really incorporating and ensuring that you have anything accessibility related as part of those highest use sites as well to check. And then it's ultimately trying to prioritize, because when you're looking at a test scope, it's going to be a lot to review. So, and we dive into that a little bit more in detail. So when we're looking at a sample test plan, first and foremost, looking at those Google Analytics, but one of the things we do is we also cross-reference it with a screen reader survey that's been going on. There's been 7 going on so far, so that way you can start to see an increase in years of the most common browsers versus the most common screen readers or assistive technology. You also want to look at the accessibility compatibility against your browsers. Not every browser is equal. And even though you might like to use Chrome best or Safari, that might not necessarily be what your users with assistive technology usually use. Looking at it from keyboard accessibility. So starting with your manual check of keyboard, throw away that mouse and just start tabbing through. Can you access everything on the page? Is it in that logical order? Is it taking focus? Then we look at code validation as well as automated accessibility checks from there, and then finally closing that out with that manual and functional testing of looking at, user stories with individuals with disabilities, what it might look like if you want to start doing some easy checks on your own for some manual testing. And what happens is we have links throughout these, and these two here will actually dive into W3C, one giving you web stories with individuals with disabilities, the other one giving you some basic easy checks, and also referencing those back to the W3C regulations. If you're looking at this from a perspective to say, you know what, I don't have any, don't know where to start, just start asking yourself some simple questions. If you're using any assistive technology to do your testing, ask yourself, why is it reading something before I'm there? Or maybe it's reading something that's not even on the page. Or it might be reading something that's not taking focus. So why is it reading what it's reading if you're using assistive technology to check? Maybe if you're tabbing through, there's no skip to content link, and a skip to content is one of the first or second things that you should see on a page. So if a customer or a client is familiar with your page, they don't want to have to tab 20 times to get through your entire navigation, but rather they can actually go to and tab one of the first or second items on your link, and it's going to be a skip to navigation. They select that, and it's going to jump them down to the meat of the page, so that way they don't have to hit tab 15 or 20 times through that nav. If you're looking at it from images, are all of your images tagged properly? Eduardo spoke briefly on this. Or is it pulling in from the image saving name? Because often if that's the case, then it might read as image 123, and what does that mean? Is there anything else? What did I miss on the page? Is there something missing that as a user with assistive technology or disability, I'm not able to access? So when we're looking at that screen reader survey, this one, and I apologize, it's a little small on your screen, but it's linked so you can go directly to it, but it's the contents of it. So when you're looking at this, you can actually look to see the screen reader proficiency, the low-cost screen readers, and really the most to look at is the screen reader commonly used, and also the screen reader browser combination. So that way we use this and then cross-reference that to your Google Analytics, to the most common browsers you use. So then that way you can kind of see where you might want to start checking for accessibility. When we're looking at that browser compatibility, the same thing, and this actually links out to the HTML5 accessibility. So when you are looking at those Google Analytics and that screen reader survey, and it might show, okay, between the two, we have Safari and we have Chrome as the most used as our Google Analytics, but as part of the screen reader survey, we see Edge and Safari as the two most used. Well, in that instance, we might think about, okay, well, when we start to incorporate accessibility, which browser is going to give us the most features? And then that way you can look here, and by going to the site, there's a feature support. So it'll actually tell you which browser will actually support the accessibility feature that you're trying to include. So it's just good to know what might work, because sometimes it's a simple statement on your page to say this is best viewed in Edge 16 or Safari. So that way individuals will know if they're a common user of Internet Explorer 11, it's not going to work best for them. Not because of anything you're doing, but because of the features available in that specific browser. So just letting your users know up front is always beneficial. So when we're looking at some automated testing as well, in this instance, a couple different automated tools are, first and foremost, code validation. There's a great code validator from W3C, and what happens is if you check for your code prior to even looking for accessibility, it's automatically going to enhance your accessibility if you can fix those code problems. So, open the browser, put the navigation URL in, and run that. So the validator.w3.org is the one that we often use because it's from W3C. And in this instance, you can also check the link checkers. You can check the CSS validation. There's even a mobile portion of this. There's even some internationalization for the checker there. So there's a lot of different features that you can do, but check your code first to make sure it's validated, and if so, you can fix those areas, which is automatically going to incorporate better accessibility. When we're looking at automated tools, same thing, open up your browser, put in a URL, and have it run for that. Now keep in mind, some of the things to think about right now is your automated tools are just that, they're automated. And it doesn't matter if it's a free tool or if it's a paid tool. Regardless, there's limited expectation of automated tools can check for anywhere from 25, 30 to 35, 40%, depending upon the tool. And even in that instance, as a true 100% automation, only about half of that percentage is true automation. So it will check for images missing alt text, but it can't necessarily check for color being used on the page, because what happens is it creates this semi-manual check that requires a human to say, oh yeah, there is color used on the page, but it's not color alone, so we're okay. So even though you're talking about that 25 to 40%, only about half of that is true automation. So that's why really that manual testing, that functional testing plays such an important role. But using automated where you can to incorporate that and speed things up in your checking is not a bad thing either. So looking at this and kind of incorporating the different tools, using the best resources available to you is important. And part of that is a lot of what we do as essential accessibility as well. And just know that most all of 2.1 right now requires manual testing. Automated tools may say it's been incorporated into it, but what it's going to do is it's going to come up as that checklist for an individual to still having to manually check it, because the automated tools aren't yet able to check for majority of those. So anything 2.1 will usually require manual testing. Eduardo, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you, Kara. Yes, absolutely. So I'll stress there's no magic wand at this point in time for automated testing for accessibility. You must perform manual testing. And one of the great things of doing manual testing is if you want to start off with that, create user stories. So your team can actually be set for success when it comes to integrating accessibility into the development lifecycle. I'm going to just read off one of the ones that we have here. As a user who has trouble reading due to low vision, I want to be able to make the text larger on the screen so that I can read it. Just pretty straightforward and basic, but again, it sets your team for success and allows you to actually have some measurements and allows you to conform and create some user acceptance criteria to be able to identify some of the best practices around those user stories. Not only that, but it also allows you to refine some estimates, some remediations, and create some specific unit tests and around those specific user stories. So again, highly recommended, and definitely when you're trying to do or implement manual testing. So let's talk about testing environments as well. And I touched on those earlier. Definitely those are very, very important because you want to ensure that you're covering off every aspect of that. And let's just jump right into the keyboard accessibility. That's a pretty easy check together with with as you're doing the manual testing. And how do you do that? Well, Kara was just talking about skip links. An easy to implement fix, but it allows you to just instead of tabbing along all the navigation menus, you skip to the main content, the first heading level structure, and move on. So basically, all you do is you want to be able to access all the site navigation, all the form controls via the keyboard, and any other functionality that you may have with the mouse. You also want to have that with the keyboard. You want to determine that all the content and functions can be keyboard control, and you want to visually confirm that the objects do have a visual focus, that little rectangle around the different elements. And then talking about keyboard navigation, you want to make sure that, again, you meet all the keyboard accessible criteria by ensuring that all the navigation and the interface elements are operable through keyboard controls only, that all the headings and the focusable elements permit interface navigation for screen readers, and that the elements change visually to indicate focus, and there is no keyboard traps. We talked about that earlier. And if you have any accessibility key commands, that they do not conflict with any key commands in the native application or browser, and no other keyboard specific barriers are present. So again, high level, that's all you have. And some of the talking points that we have are included in the notes of the presentation, which we will be sharing with the audience. Kara, back to you.
All right, so finishing this out as part of your manual and functional, as well as using the assistive technology that your users with disabilities would be using. Using some of the built-in features as part of your operating systems as well, whether it's a Windows or a Mac or iOS or an Android. And checking these things as well is going to be very important. So as part of that, just to kind of give you an idea, the screenshot that you see on the page is actually from that called NVDA, which is the non-visual desktop access. And what happens is individuals using screen readers will actually often use something called a links list, or they might bring up the headings, and that's how they'll actually navigate through the page. So if I go through and look at my links list, this is also an easy way to check for it, to say if I find something that says click here, then I know it's going to be an area that I need to insert more information as my link naming, because it isn't giving a descriptive information. Same thing goes for headings. If my headings are out of order, this is a quick and easy way to check for that, because again, individuals with assistive technology will often use headings as part of their navigation. Same thing goes with landmarks. So if you have a top nav versus a side nav or things like that, if those aren't named properly and they just come up as banner, then that will also cause problems for when people are using assistive technology. We check all of these things when we do our manual and our functional testing, and we too use assistive technology as part of some of these features. So when we're looking at this for mobile devices, because a lot more individuals are using mobile. So for Android as well as iOS, first and foremost, use the built-in features to check for accessibility. So this kind of goes across the board for both of them. Android, though, also allows for some platform supports for frameworks, such as the Android Accessibility Scanner simulation, and you can also check for some of the frameworks using something like Espresso or things like that. And this is going to allow you to create some automation to your testing, as well as still do your manual and functional. The same thing really goes to your iOS testing as well. There's far more built-in accessibility to the iOS. Android is really catching up to that, and they're doing a lot better. But in that instance, when it comes to the iOS testing, the steps to do that are far less for iOS because of the way they're all integrated versus that of Android itself. So when we're trying to talk about the prioritization, when we provide and we do testing for our clients, we provide a prioritization level, so that way they'll know what needs to be fixed most. So critical is meaning essentially a user cannot access information, they're being blocked, and essentially they could possibly leave your website. So that is your top priority to make your changes. Your high priority is still going to say there's serious barrier to where it might cause extended time, or they might not be able to access a portion of the page, but they can access majority of the page. But again, there could be some frustration and they could still choose to leave the page. Your medium and low is a little less. It's not to say it shouldn't be fixed, because it should. It's just usually that's what you see as a second priority. And sometimes that's going to be a label that might say name for a field, but then someone may have also added an ARIA label, so it reads name twice. Well, reading name twice is better than not reading it at all, so that still might come up as a lower medium, but still would need to be corrected. Oftentimes we're asked a lot of times of, okay, now you've told me which standards apply to me based upon my role. How do I know what's critical versus what's high? So we're providing just more of a high-level checklist to kind of use this and cross-reference it to those standards or those guidelines that we showed you earlier as to what applies to your role specifically. So this will give you a little more information to help you prioritize some of that when you do your remediation. When you're also looking at the remediation, look at the impact. Impact to a number of users, impact to types of disabilities. We also can do a more detailed prioritization method on our reports for our clients as to which ones impact which disabilities. Look at your data content. If it's old content, it's oftentimes better to replace it rather than fix it. Also look at some of your easiest repairs, and finally use your resources available to you. When we're looking at reports, we do actually have a must-have WCAG 2.0 checklist as well as a 2.1 checklist, and you can actually go to our website and under the resource section and find a lot of our case studies, and that's where you'll also have this checklist where you can fill out, and we'll email that back out to you. But then WebAIM also provides a checklist. Alley Project has a HTML version of a checklist. But if you're ever wanting to actually look at trying to report, there's actually W3C provides a report as well, and we actually mimic our template very similar to that, to where when we do our testing, we'll provide you the success criteria that the error goes against, the URL that it's applied to, a screenshot of that, as well as some recommended code, as well as the error issues as well. So we've covered an awful lot in a very short amount of time. Our information contact is there below, and we look forward to hearing any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Eduardo and Kara. That was amazing, really chock full of so much information. We have quite a few questions from folks, and some of these questions you actually answered as the presentation went on. There were a couple that I may have missed or maybe didn't cover. So let me just ask you a few of these with the minute we have remaining. One is, you mentioned a number of different tools and resources to assess if apps and websites are accessible. Can you use any of these tools with prototypes, for example, with Axure?
Eduardo, I'll give that one to you.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, the one that comes to mind is color contrast analyzer. You know, if you have the hex code of the colors, background and foreground, you can definitely test for that. And that's the one that comes to mind right off the bat. Kara, I don't know if there's anything else that pops up on your end.
It really depends upon the application and the level of whether or not you're looking at code versus other applications that might have to have third-party pieces built into them. I know as designers, usually it's a little bit more difficult to find tools that might work within the platforms they're working in because it's not HTML yet. So maybe looking at, is there an HTML, or maybe is there a way to push it out to CSS to use some of these other tools? There's also some free downloadable tools that you can use. Is it HHacker, I believe, is one, and there's another one that's, the name is escaping me at this time. But there's also some items like the color checker that Eduardo had mentioned that does color contrast. Color contrast always checks for the color blindness as well, so it does check for the scales, the color contrast there.
Okay, awesome. And one quick last question. Do you have any recommendations on how to find users who would be appropriate for accessible studies?
accessible studies like research, or accessible more like your users to test?
Users to test with.
A lot of times that's where individuals either hire outright or hire contract companies such as ourselves to do the manual and functional testing. That's all I know. Eduardo, do you know of any other options?
Yeah, well, the other one that comes to mind, there are non-for-profit organizations out there like Columbia Lighthouse for the Blind. They may have individuals with disabilities, also rehabilitation centers. That may be another one, but those are the ones that come to mind.
Yeah, and in my experience too, I've conducted research with blind users, and now I have ongoing relationships with focus group facilities, basically, who have participant databases with blind users. So I continue to reach out to them. So I agree. You know, there's some organizations that have these lists, and you kind of have to find them and then continue to have those relationships with them. I'm happy to share the folks I've worked with too, if anybody's interested in that. All right, well, we are over by 2 minutes. Thank you so much again, Eduardo and Kara. This was really great. And just as a reminder to all the folks on the line, I know there's a bunch of questions that we didn't get to. I'll be sharing that with Eduardo and Kara so they can respond offline. And also we'll be sharing the slide deck as well as the recording with everyone. So thank you so much. Thanks for joining us. And thank you, Eduardo and Kara.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, thanks.